We've been inching our way along here on the Eightfold Path. I always get a little sidetracked because we come upon things like in right mindfulness, we come upon the four foundations of mindfulness. And so it's a natural inclination to go off into some tangents to just be reminded of what the four foundations of mindfulness are, because that's pretty important to our practice of mindfulness. And we have the mindfulness of the body, which we spoke about, and mindfulness of feelings, which we went some into last time. And just in honor of wrapping up the end of the year, but I know I'm not going to make it through, I want to mention that the last two of the foundations of mindfulness are mindfulness of the mind and mindfulness of mental objects. And these things can become very confusing. So I don't want it to seem too intellectual, but I do want to mention that in mindfulness of the mind, it's referring to watching various mental states that arise and pass away. You know, it's like I was mentioning earlier, the greedy or the non-greedy. There's the ill will or the non-ill will. There's maybe the ignorant or the discerning mind. And it's really, we observe these states. It's not anything new to the mindfulness meditation. It's just that as we're developing in our mindfulness practice, we might notice mind states arise. And so it's really kind of impossible to separate consciousness from the mind states and from the mental objects. They're pretty close together because they arise and pass away together. And so you can notice, though, when consciousness has been affected by a negative mental quality, like greed or hatred or confusion or depression or restlessness, or by positive qualities like generosity and patience and loving-friendliness. So we can notice when our consciousness has been affected by qualities of the mind, and we can give each mental state the attention that it deserves as it arises, without doing anything specific about it, or without allowing ourselves to get involved or to follow for too long with the thought or the feeling. And we watch as each of the mind states arises and falls. And, you know, this arising and falling is the nature of the entire mind. That every moment, many times in every moment, as the Buddha discovered, the mind arises, it reaches a peak and passes away. And it's the same for any mind of any being in the universe. And the more that we observe this rising and falling of all the mental qualities, and the more volatile we can know them to be, and then seeing this volatility, we see insight into the impermanent phenomenon that's called the mind. And so the more we focus on the mind itself, the less solid it seems. And like everything else that exists, it's always changing, as Doug pointed out earlier today. And, you know, we discover that there's no permanent entity, that there's no one. You've probably heard the analogy before of the movie projector, that there's no one really running the movie projector, that it's all in flux and that it's all in flow and it's all a process. And, you know, in reality, who we are is simply this constant change of flowing moments of the mind. And since we can't control this process, we don't have any choice except to just let go. And we can experience joy, and we can taste that instant of freedom and happiness. And, you know, this is sort of the goal of the of the Buddha's path, to know that this mind can be used to actually gain wisdom. And mindfulness of mental objects, I mean, it sounds kind of like it's something new to the practice, but it's just another way of describing the insight practice that we're already doing, that mental objects refers to thoughts. And here it means all conscious mental activities. So thoughts have a lot of categories, as was sort of come about by the Buddhist teachings. There's the fetters, there's the hindrances, there are the aggregates of existence, and there are the factors of enlightenment, and there's the Four Noble Truths, and they arise in any order. And so while we're sitting in meditation and practicing with a certain intended object, like if we start with the breath, and then we become mindful of another thought that might arise, like maybe there's a hindrance or a doubt or an aspect of one of the aggregates, and then there's a mental object of the thought. So there's always a constantly temporary, changing object for our meditation. And we notice the mental objects arise and fade. So it's really just another continued description of the practice itself. But if it's unwholesome, we have the ability to, if it persists, to let it go as best we can. The Buddha even talks, we always laugh about this, he talks about if an unwholesome thought persists in the mind, that you do whatever is necessary to get rid of it. And one of the descriptions is jumping up and down and pulling your ears. So there's while we talk about mindfulness as just watching everything arise and pass away, the purpose is not to just watch things arise and pass away or just be with the breath. We really want to see more clearly that freedom is available. And if we let go as much as we can of what's wholesome and embrace of what's unwholesome and embrace what we can of what's wholesome, and those are also things that we might be aware during our sitting practice. The mind can be clear, and we can begin to see that everything that we experience might fit into something like the Four Noble Truths. Or we might realize that the mind could be focusing on the factors of enlightenment. So when mindfulness is steady and strong and we notice its strength, and it can become our object of meditation itself. And so we know that we're mindful. And mindfulness can often even become the mental object of mindfulness. So this awareness of mindfulness sheds light on our own experience of form, of the body, of feelings, of perceptions, and volitional formations and consciousness, so that we can see them more clearly. And we get encouraged by this awareness, and then we just continue with our mindfulness training. And it's what we've been practicing all along, developing on the Buddha's path. And mindfulness is one of the cardinal factors on the path. And so eventually, after a lot of work, we come to a point where mindfulness can become deeper and clearer and stronger. And we can know that mindfulness gets more established. And it raises to a level that becomes a factor of enlightenment. So I don't want this to get too much more confusing. But there's this beam of powerful mindfulness that can focus on our experience of any object that we investigate, and then we see that object's impermanent nature. And then the object disappears, and another object arises, revealing that same truth of impermanence and dissatisfaction and selflessness. And so when the next experience arises, we might think, okay, this one's permanent. And then, our investigation reveals that it too is changing. So as we continue to look for that truth and continue to find all our experiences share these same three characteristics, then our investigation becomes a factor of enlightenment. So there's different levels of mindfulness. And I think I'll stop there so that we can have a little conversation before Doug and Sherry and whoever else needs to leave right away can leave.